She walked onto the dusty track wearing worn jeans, an old racing hoodie, and a pair of faded sneakers, the kind of outfit more suited to someone dropping off coffee than preparing to race. No gloves, no crew, no sponsor patches, just a clipboard under one arm and a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The late morning sun bounced off metal bleachers and glinted off polished helmets, but she paid it no mind. Her eyes were steady, scanning the rows of cars and pit crews with quiet interest. The Hollow Ridge Speedway was the pride of the valley, home to a loyal crowd, a reputation for gritty local legends, and one golden boy in particular, Connor Holt. A three-time champion with a toothy grin and a signature blue car, Connor drew fans from 3 counties and never let anyone forget it. As the woman stepped up to the registration table, the man behind the desk barely looked up. "Spectators need to stay behind the fence," he said automatically. She adjusted her grip on the clipboard. "I'm here to register. Open class, 1 lap qualifier." Now he looked up, slowly. "You? You're driving?" She nodded. "Is that a problem?" He blinked, then shook his head. "No, no, just not what we're used to." From behind the barrier, a group of crew members snickered. One of them nudged the man next to him and gestured toward her with his chin. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn on the way to the farmer's market." She ignored it. She was used to this. Being underestimated was practically background noise. She filled out the form, handed it back, and walked toward the far corner of the lot where an older model car sat quietly in the shade. It was a 1992 Mazda RX-7. The paint faded in places, the tires dusty, but the engine beneath the hood had been rebuilt piece by piece in a small garage over the past year. She knew every bolt, every weld, every vibration. She opened the door, slid in, and took a deep breath. Not to calm herself, but to remember. The smell of worn leather, oil, and sun-baked vinyl was home. She adjusted her mirrors, pulled her hair back into a low knot, and waited for her turn. When her number was finally called, she rolled forward slowly, the engine quiet but tight. Around her, the other drivers leaned on their cars, arms crossed, expressions amused. Connor stood near his team, tossing a water bottle in the air, clearly not concerned. The announcer's voice came over the loudspeaker. "And up next, car number 34. Not much info on this one, folks. No sponsors, no time trials on record. Let's see what happens." She pulled up to the starting line, eyes fixed ahead, hands steady. A flag official motioned her forward. The light changed. Green. She hit the throttle. The engine roared. Not flashy, not showy, but smooth and precise. The tires gripped hard into the first turn, and in that moment, the smirks from the crew members disappeared. She moved through the lap with surgical control. Her braking was clean. Her corners were tight. She accelerated out of turns like she had been born on this track. The bleachers went quiet as she passed the halfway point. The announcer stammered over the mic. Uh, car 34 moving well. Really well. That's not bad, folks. That is actually not bad at all." Connor had moved closer to the rail, his jaw tight. He watched as the unknown woman guided her machine through the final stretch, hugging the inside like it owed her money. The finish line came faster than anyone expected. She crossed it and pulled off to the side without flourish, parking neatly in the cooling zone. No fist pumps, no celebration. She shut off the engine and stepped out. The track official jogged toward her, radio in hand, his face flushed with disbelief. "You beat Holt's qualifier. By a second and a half around the paddock, silence fractured into low murmurs. A few heads turned. One mechanic whistled under his breath. The man at the registration desk looked like he had seen a ghost. Connor was no longer smiling. She nodded once. "Thanks," she said, and turned back to her car. She wiped down the steering wheel, checked the tire pressure, and zipped her bag. She had not come to humiliate anyone. She had come to see what her car could do, what she could do. But the message had landed. After her lap, the energy at Hollow Ridge changed. The smug smiles faded into narrowed eyes and whispered questions. Mechanics leaned closer to their radios. Crew chiefs checked data logs twice. The anonymous woman who had wandered in like she was lost had now posted the fastest time of the day, and she had done it with no fanfare, no pit crew, and no high-tech telemetry. Connor Holt paced near his trailer, watching the monitors as her lap replayed in slow motion. Every corner was clean, every line efficient. She had not muscled the car into submission. She had danced with it, balanced and intentional. One of his teammates muttered, "That had to be a fluke. Lucky tires or wind shift or something." Connor did not answer. He just stared at the screen. A few reporters who had been assigned to cover his expected fourth title drifted toward her car, curious now. She answered their questions politely but briefly. No, she was not sponsored. Yes, she had built the car herself. No, she did not have a team. One of them asked, "What made you come out today?" She looked past the camera toward the empty stands beyond the fence. "To see if I was still fast," she said, "and to stop waiting for permission." The clip aired on local sports news that evening. It spread quickly. The next morning, her inbox was full of inquiries. Shops asking about her build specs, podcasts requesting interviews, a few upstart sponsors sniffing around for association. She answered none of them. She was not interested in being a symbol. She was interested in the next lap. Word spread fast around the racing circuit. By the time the main event rolled around, the stands were fuller than usual. People came not just to see Connor win again, but to see the quiet woman in the faded hoodie and her dusty RX-7. The pits buzzed with activity. Some drivers nodded at her in passing, respectful now. Others still gave her side-eye, threatened by what she represented, a disruption. A reminder that talent does not always arrive wearing the right jacket. She stayed focused, reviewing her notes and sipping from a bottle of water she had brought from home. When her name was called during introductions, the applause was louder than expected. She gave a small wave, then retreated to her car. As the race began, it was clear that something had shifted. Connor took the early lead, but it was not dominant. She stayed close, weaving through traffic with calm precision. Her car did not have the horsepower of his, but she made up for it in control, in timing, in sheer will. By the halfway mark, the gap had narrowed to less than a car length. The crowd was on its feet. The announcers were no longer reciting sponsor names, they were breathless. "She's still there, folks. Lap after lap, she is still there." On lap 22, she made her move. It was subtle, surgical, a slipstream maneuver on the backstretch, followed by a late break entry into turn 4. She emerged ahead. The crowd erupted. Connor pushed hard, trying to reclaim his lead, but every line he took she covered with perfect anticipation. It was not just skill, it was intuition. She was not just racing the track, she was reading it. By the final lap, she held her lead like it had always belonged to her. The checkered flag waved, and she crossed the finish line alone. Her time was the fastest in the track's recorded history for an open-class event. She coasted through the cool-down lap and pulled into the pit lane, heart steady, hands still. The crew members who had once scoffed now stood in stunned silence. She parked, climbed out, and removed her helmet slowly. A hush fell over the crowd as cameras zoomed in. She did not raise her fists or jump on the hood. She simply nodded once and walked over to check her tire wear. When a track official approached to hand her the trophy, she accepted it politely and set it on her workbench, not caring that it gleamed under the sun. It was never about the trophy. Connor approached her a few minutes later, his face unreadable. She stood, wiping her hands with a rag. "Hell of a lap," he said. She met his eyes. "Thanks." He looked down at the car, then back at her. "You really built this yourself?" She nodded. "In a borrowed garage, nights and weekends." He gave a low whistle. "Well, you got something special." She looked past him toward the track. "It is not about the car," she said. "It is about who listens when it speaks." Connor looked at her like he was seeing something for the first time. Then he extended a hand. "Hope we race again." She shook it. "We will." That evening, she loaded her gear with the same quiet efficiency. The headlines would talk about the upset, the underdog, the woman who came out of nowhere. But she had not come out of nowhere. She had always been here, waiting, working, listening, and now she had arrived on her own terms. The following weekend, she received an email from a small regional race series asking if she would be willing to participate in an upcoming invitational. No fanfare, no sponsorship strings, just a polite note from a race director who had heard about what she had done at Hollow Ridge. She responded with a simple yes. The event was held at a track 2 hours north, smaller and less maintained, but with tighter turns and a history of producing gritty, real racers. When she arrived, some of the drivers recognized her immediately. Others did not, at least not at first. The moment she started tuning her car, though, those who had doubted began to reconsider. She worked alone, setting the tire pressure, checking the suspension, listening to the idle like it was a language only she understood. During qualifiers, she posted the third fastest time, not her best, but enough to earn a front row start. The announcer mentioned her calmly, without condescension this time. And here's a name you might remember from Hollow Ridge. She is back, and she is serious. In the paddock, a young boy approached her with a hat in one hand and a small notebook in the other. "You beat Mr. Holt," he said with awe. "My dad says you drive like a ghost. No wasted moves." She crouched down to his level. "Your dad is kind," she said, "but the trick is not to be fast. The trick is to be smooth. Smooth becomes fast." The boy nodded solemnly like she had passed down a sacred formula. She signed his hat and returned to her work. That race did not go as smoothly. Her car began to misfire around lap 15. Something in the ignition coil faltered, and she dropped to 5th place before she could make a fix. But instead of pulling off, she adjusted her rhythm, short shifting, coasting on corners, compensating for the lack of power with sharper lines. She clawed her way back to 3rd by the final lap, crossing the finish line with an engine that wheezed its way to a halt. She rolled it into the paddock, popped the hood, and started troubleshooting. A few mechanics watched her from a distance, waiting to see if she would call for help. She did not. She pulled out a worn socket set and leaned into the engine bay like she was hugging an old friend. By the time the sun dipped low, she had it running again. It was not about the podium that day. It was about resilience, about knowing that even when your machine betrays you, you stay with it. You learn, you adjust. She did not win that race, but she earned something deeper: respect. From fellow drivers, from pit crews, from fans who now saw her not as a novelty, but as a force. The next morning, a short article appeared in a motorsport blog titled "The Woman Who Fixes Her Own Wins." It ended with a simple line: "She did not come to be seen. She came to be remembered." 3 weeks later, she got an invitation from a much larger event, the Rivermount Rally Series. It was a qualifying round for a national competition, and the entry list read like a who's who of semi-pro racing. She almost turned it down. The entry fee alone was steep, and the travel costs would stretch what was left of her savings. But something inside her stirred. The part of her that used to watch races from behind the fence as a kid, scribbling lap times into notebooks while dreaming about a driver's seat of her own. She entered. She packed her bags. She borrowed a trailer from a retired driver she had once helped at a gas station during a snowstorm. When she arrived at Rivermount, no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. In fact, a few drivers came over to shake her hand. She still had no sponsors, no crew, and no glossy PR bio, but her reputation had arrived ahead of her. During the practice session, she kept her head down, methodical as always. She learned the track like it was a language. First the vocabulary of the turns, then the grammar of the hills and blind corners. When qualifying came, she posted the second fastest time. One of the track commentators said, "She's quiet, but she's consistent, and in racing, consistency wins." But on race day, clouds rolled in. Rain started midway through the first lap. Half the field panicked, tires locked, lines fell apart. But not hers. Her movements were not disrupted. They were adapted. She eased into every turn like she had always known the storm was coming. While others fought the track, she listened to it. And the track, in return, let her through. By lap 12, she was in first, and she stayed there. When she pulled into the winner's circle, her car was splattered in mud, her hoodie soaked through, her eyes sharp as ever. A reporter leaned in with a microphone. "You just beat a field full of national contenders on a rain-soaked track. How do you explain that?" She thought for a second, then said, "A dry line teaches you where to go. A wet line teaches you who you are." It was not a soundbite. It was truth, and people heard it. In the weeks that followed Rivermount, the racing world kept buzzing. What had started as a whispered story about a woman with no sponsors had now become a rallying cry. Clips of her rain-soaked win circulated on motorsport forums, social media feeds, and even mainstream sports shows. People latched onto her quotes, replayed her lap footage, and speculated about her next move. Her name, once unknown, was now mentioned alongside experienced veterans. But she did not change. She still prepped her car alone, still declined flashy endorsements, still answered every question with clarity, humility, and zero theatrics. When one network offered her a paid feature with makeup, wardrobe, and a studio crew, she politely declined and said, "The car is the story." What mattered to her were the roads ahead, not red carpets, not fame, just clean tarmac, sharp corners, and engines that told the truth. She continued entering local and regional races, some high profile, some not. She won some, lost others, and never once made excuses. At one event, after a flat tire cost her a first-place finish, she was seen kneeling beside her vehicle, showing a young girl how to plug a puncture without panicking. The girl's father watched in quiet awe, and later told a reporter, "My daughter used to think only boys raced. Now she wants socket wrenches for her birthday." A few weeks later, that same girl mailed Clara a thank you card with glitter along the edges and the words, "I will race someday too." Clara pinned it above her workbench next to a worn-out stopwatch and a tiny keychain with the number 34 on it, the number she had been assigned at Hollow Ridge. Not because she needed to remember her first race, but because she refused to forget the moment the world tried to tell her she did not belong. In early spring, she received an invitation to one of the most anticipated events of the season, the National Open at Coldwater Speedway. Known for its blistering straights, punishing chicanes, and unpredictable elevation changes, Coldwater was not a track for the faint of heart. Big-name racers entered, sponsors fought for banner space, the crowd size rivaled minor league baseball games. Clara arrived with the same trailer, the same car, and the same calm that had carried her through every lap before. But this time, she noticed something different. A small group of girls stood near the fence, watching her unload. One of them wore a hoodie just like hers. Another had drawn a picture of her car in crayon, taped to the inside of a homemade sign that read, "Go Clara." She gave them a small nod, then went to work. Coldwater was unforgiving. During practice, 2 cars spun out on turn 7. Another clipped the inside curb and cracked an axle. But Clara studied the course with her signature patience. She adjusted her tire pressure for the incline, tuned her downforce for the hairpins, and kept her movements deliberate. She posted the 4th best qualifying time, not dominant, but calculated. The night before the race, a journalist tried to press her about rivalries. "Do you see this as a grudge match against Holt? You know he's here too." Clara just smiled. "I do not race people. I race the track." And then she turned back to her notes. Race day arrived with clear skies and full stands. The air vibrated with anticipation. Engines warmed, flags waved. As she pulled into position, helmet on, gloves tight, she glanced once toward the bleachers where the girls in matching hoodies waved furiously. The green light dropped, and the silence broke. The first 5 laps were chaos. Holt took an early lead, roaring ahead with the aggression of someone with something to prove. Clara stayed tucked behind the lead pack, keeping her car steady, letting the front runners wear themselves down. The track was unforgiving, just as she expected. By lap 10, 2 cars had already gone wide. One blew a gasket. Holt was fast, no question. But fast without discipline cracks eventually. Clara waited for her moment. Lap 12, turn 5. He oversteered. Just a little. Enough. Clara slipped through the inside like water through a crack in stone. From the bleachers came a collective gasp, then a roar. Holt recovered quickly and stayed on her tail, but he had to push harder now. Clara did not. She let the track guide her, corner to corner, throttle to brake, as if she had carved it with her own hands. With each lap, she widened the gap, not by force, by feel. She was not overpowering the course, she was respecting it. As the final lap began, Holt gave everything he had. Clara felt it in her mirrors, but she never flinched. The crowd was on its feet. The announcers stumbled over each other's voices. "She's still holding it. This could be history. Here they come. Final turn." And then it happened. The checkered flag dropped, and Clara crossed the line first. Her time? A new course record. She eased into the pit lane and rolled to a stop, engine humming like it was smiling. She stepped out slowly. Holt approached seconds later, helmet in hand. This time there was no forced handshake, no sarcasm, just a quiet nod. "You earned it," he said. She nodded back. "We both did." Cameras swarmed, fans shouted, reporters surged, but Clara stayed grounded. She posed for a few pictures, signed a few autographs, then slipped away behind the crowd to sit on a folding chair near her trailer. She sipped water, breathing slow. Across the field, the girls in the matching hoodies shouted her name. One held up a sign that now read, "Lightning Clara." She waved. The days following Coldwater felt different. Not louder. Clara had never chased noise, but wider. Her inbox flooded with interview requests, panel invitations, and even a feature offer from a documentary team focused on underrepresented athletes. Her quiet victory had cracked open something bigger than a track record. It had touched something deeper in people, especially women, girls, and those who had always waited on the margins of opportunity. Yet even with all this attention, Clara stayed grounded. She returned home, unpacked her gear, and spent the next morning fixing a loose throttle response in her RX-7. She still used her original socket set, still tuned by ear. Her tools were worn, familiar, and always waiting. The next weekend she showed up at a smaller track in Willow Glen. No cameras, no big prize money, just a community benefit race to raise funds for adaptive car mods for veterans. When she walked onto the lot, a few drivers blinked in disbelief. "You came to this?" one of them asked. "After Coldwater?" Clara just smiled. "Every lap matters," she said, "especially these." She ran her race like she always did, clean, measured, calm. She came in second that day. But what mattered most was what happened afterward. A man in a wheelchair rolled up to her pit area with his daughter. "You reminded me I used to be fast," he said, "and that maybe I still can be." Clara knelt beside him and said, "Speed is not always about the car. Sometimes it is about the feeling." They shook hands. His daughter whispered, "You are her, right?" "Lightning Clara?" Clara winked. "Only on the weekends." Her story was becoming folklore, not the kind built from press releases or high-end sponsorship reels, but real stories passed between fans, pit crews, and families. A mother in Iowa started a local all-girls karting club and named it Clara's Corner. A retired mechanic wrote an op-ed in a racing magazine titled, "Finally, Someone Who Listens to Her Engine." A young rookie on the semi-pro circuit told a regional broadcaster that Clara was the reason she had stopped second-guessing herself every time she entered the paddock. Meanwhile, Clara kept showing up, at tracks big and small, in weather good and bad. She did not dominate every race, but she left a mark at all of them. One week she won with a perfect overtake on a wide circuit in Arizona. The next, she finished fourth after a battery failure cut her acceleration in half. Her reaction? "It is not about being flawless. It is about being honest." During a televised event in Colorado, she was asked what made her different. Clara thought for a long moment and finally said, "I think people feel seen when they watch me drive. Not because I am fast, but because I do not pretend." That quote ended up on shirts, bumper stickers, and social media headers. But to Clara, it was not branding. It was just truth. She returned home to a garage that still smelled like dust and grease, where the sun hit her bench just right each morning. She worked on her RX-7, then began building a second car, a stripped-down Miata she planned to donate to a youth karting mentorship program. She had no formal team, no publicist, but she had a growing tribe of believers, people who knew that sometimes the most powerful engine was the one that had been dismissed. In late summer, Clara received a quiet invitation, handwritten, with a simple embossed crest on the envelope. It came from the Hollow Ridge Board of Directors, the same organization that once barely acknowledged her registration form. The letter thanked her for elevating the track's legacy and invited her to serve as a guest speaker at their annual Community Motorsport Gala. The irony was not lost on her. The same bleachers that had echoed with snickers when she first arrived would now host a banquet in her honor. But Clara was not bitter. She had moved too far, learned too much. She accepted the invitation on one condition, that young drivers from the local outreach programs be allowed to attend and speak. The board agreed. When she walked into the event hall weeks later, wearing her cleanest jeans and a black button-down shirt, she was met not with silence, but with applause. Some guests stood, some simply smiled in recognition. A man from the original registration desk approached with a sheepish smile. "I still remember that first day," he said. "You changed everything." Clara shook his hand. "I didn't change anything," she said. "I just reminded people that speed has many faces." Later, as she stood at the podium, she did not talk about her lap times. She did not talk about trophies or track records. Instead, she told the story of her first qualifying lap and what it meant to be overlooked. She looked across the room at young drivers in second-hand racing suits and said, "You do not need someone to open a door for you. You just need to learn how to take the wheel." The room went quiet. No one moved. One girl in the back wiped her eyes and whispered to the person next to her, "She's what I want to be." A few days later, Clara returned to her garage and resumed work on the Miata she was rebuilding. She had begun naming the cars she worked on, not for sentiment, but for storytelling. The RX-7 she still raced was Grain, for its unpolished perfection. The Miata she planned to donate was Spark, because she hoped it would ignite something in someone else. She worked quietly, adjusting camber angles, checking valve clearances, listening to the tick of cooling metal. It was her peace, her meditation. In between builds, she visited schools, spoke at community driver workshops, and mentored rookies who needed more encouragement than instruction. She never charged a fee. She never promoted the visits. She showed up in her hoodie, sat on garage floors, and answered questions with patience. In return, she received thank you notes scribbled in crayon, home-baked cookies in foil, and tiny model cars left at her pit station like offerings. One day, she received an envelope with no name, just a note inside that read, "I was going to quit. Then I watched your lap from Coldwater. I stayed. I placed second. Thank you." She pinned that note next to the others. The corner of her garage had become a wall of reminders of what mattered, what endured, and what had always driven her more than gasoline ever could. And still, the races came. She entered a fall series in Montana, another in Texas. She came in second twice, then first, but the numbers meant less and less. What mattered more was who waited at the fences, whose hands shook as they asked for a photo, and whose eyes lit up when she told them, "Yes, I once doubted myself too," because she had, many times. But doubt was a detour, not a stop sign. She had simply kept driving. That winter, Clara was invited to an international training summit in Sweden, hosted by a coalition of engineers and drivers focused on making motorsport more sustainable and inclusive. She almost turned it down. She was not fond of flights or hotels or catered buffets that felt more like boardrooms than racetracks. But she reconsidered after learning that half the summit attendees would be young women from underrepresented countries, girls who had never even sat in a race car, but who knew what torque meant, who understood aerodynamics, and who just needed someone to tell them they belonged. Clara accepted quietly. She packed her tools, her notebooks, and one worn hoodie. In Sweden, the cold bit through her gloves as she walked the icy practice track, but she did not flinch. A group of students watched her run test laps in a borrowed electric vehicle with amazement. It was a new platform, one she had never driven before. But as always, she listened to it. She felt the tires slide and settle. She found the rhythm in the unfamiliar. When she pulled off her helmet after a demo run, a girl from Morocco asked how long it had taken her to become confident in new vehicles. Clara smiled and said, "Confidence does not come from knowing you are ready. It comes from deciding to try before you are." That quote was written in marker on the inside of a student's suitcase lid. Another girl scribbled it onto her phone screen background. Clara spent 3 days in Sweden, and in those 3 days she became not just a racer, but a guide. She was no longer the one trying to earn space. She was making space for others. Back home, she received a letter from the Hollow Ridge Track Board again, this time with a different request. They wanted to rename the open class starting grid in her honor. Not a statue, not a building, just a sign above the staging lane that read, "Clara Reynolds starting line. Every lap counts." She sat with the idea for a while. Part of her resisted the attention, but another part, the part that remembered the sting of being told she did not look like a racer, nodded. If that sign made one more young driver feel like they belonged, it was worth it. She accepted. The dedication ceremony was small, attended by local families, racers, and a few quiet fans who brought old stopwatches and dog-eared race day flyers to be signed. One woman brought her son's first drawing of Clara's car, laminated and framed. She said, "You made him believe Fast could look like anyone." Clara smiled. Fast always could. That day, as she walked the track one more time, she paused at the line now bearing her name. The surface was worn, but the spirit was new. She ran her hand along the painted curb and remembered her first lap, what it felt like to cross it alone, underestimated, invisible. Now it held her name, not as a trophy, but as a trail, a path someone else could follow. Not every racer will break a record. Not every car will cross the finish line first, but every lap counts when you drive with purpose. Every lap teaches. Every lap matters. One afternoon in early spring, Clara stood beside her RX-7 in a quiet service bay, adjusting the distributor cap with her back to the world. The shop was part of a community college where she had recently begun volunteering twice a week, helping young mechanics prepare for certification. It was not glamorous work, no podiums, no live broadcasts, but she loved it. It felt like restoration in more ways than one. The students were a mix of ages and backgrounds. Some had grown up around cars, others had never changed a tire before, but they all listened when she spoke, especially when she knelt beside an engine block and asked them what it was telling them, not just what it needed. Clara believed in that distinction, the difference between dictating and discovering. One student, a teenage girl with frizzy hair and oil-streaked jeans, stayed after class to ask if it was okay to feel scared about driving fast. Clara had smiled and said, "Of course it is. Fear just means you are paying attention. Let it sharpen you, not stop you." The girl nodded slowly and returned to her workbench with new steadiness in her hands. These were the moments Clara lived for. Not the roar of the crowd, but the quiet confidence born from being heard. She drove less that season, not out of burnout, but because she realized her legacy would never be measured only in lap times. It would live in the drivers who kept going because she once did. It would live in the way she rewired expectation, not just engines. On the last day of the semester, her students presented her with a plaque made from a retired rotor, engraved crudely but lovingly with the words, "Thanks for letting us try." Clara teared up when no one was looking and hung it in her garage. A few weeks later, she returned to the same racetrack where she had first shocked the circuit. But this time, she sat in the stands. She watched a new crop of drivers take their first nervous laps, one of them piloting the very Miata she had built and donated. The crowd did not know her name, but the girl behind the wheel did. And when she crossed the finish line, pumping her fists into the air after a clean lap, Clara smiled and whispered to herself, "She knows she belongs." That summer, a group of international educators contacted Clara about designing a mobile motorsport curriculum for underserved schools. They had read about her technical workshops, her speaking engagements, and the mentorship notes scrawled by students and fans alike. Clara spent weeks sketching ideas in her garage, foldable pit setups, interactive modules on engine dynamics, even a driving simulator inside a retrofitted school bus. She named the project The Line, a nod to the racing term and to the invisible threshold so many kids were told they could never cross. With grant funding and donated parts, Clara helped assemble the first prototype herself. It launched in 5 rural districts and was met with overwhelming enthusiasm. Students who had never even heard the growl of an engine now got to disassemble a carburetor, chart torque curves, and learn what timing really meant. The bus even featured a mini track out back, where kids took turns navigating cones in electric go-karts. Clara visited each site during its pilot run, standing quietly near the simulator as kids screamed with joy and pride when they completed laps. One boy asked if she had ever driven in snow. She told him about Sweden, about the way ice demands respect, and how control is not about force, it is about timing and trust. He wrote her a letter 2 weeks later, calling her his favorite driver and sending a photo of a car he drew in her colors. She added it to her growing collection. These were no longer just mementos. They were proof that impact could ripple beyond asphalt. Clara never thought she would be an architect of opportunity, but life had a way of opening doors when you refused to wait for them. The final school Clara visited before the summer break had a surprise waiting for her, A group of students had formed a team, designed their own logo, and named it Throttle and Thought. Their motto was painted in bold letters across the bus: "We build, therefore we race." As Clara watched them run their first track demo, she was not thinking about her next race. She was thinking about the kids, about legacy, about everything a simple woman in an old hoodie could set in motion just by showing up, staying kind, and refusing to back down. Autumn arrived with golden trees, cooler air, and fewer races on the calendar. Clara welcomed the quiet. Her garage was stocked with small projects: fan-repaired intake manifolds, letters needing responses, and a freshly sanded toolbox she had been meaning to repaint since spring. She spent more time walking the trails behind her house, listening to leaves crunch underfoot instead of gravel beneath tires. And yet, the racing world had not forgotten her. One morning, she woke to a message from the National Motorsports Association. They wanted to honor her with a Lifetime Contribution Award, not for speed, not for wins, but for the way she had changed the culture, from the inside, without shouting, without demanding, without compromise. Clara read the message 3 times before setting her phone down and staring at the ceiling. She never drove to earn plaques, but she knew symbols mattered, especially when they gave others permission to dream. She agreed to attend the ceremony on one condition: that the award be presented by a student from the very first workshop she ever taught. That student, now 19, wore a navy jumpsuit and trembling hands as she stood on stage and read a tribute she had written herself. It ended with, "You never made us feel small, even when the world did." Clara hugged her tightly, whispered thank you, and turned to the crowd. She spoke simply, the same way she always had. "When I started, no one expected me to finish a lap. That gave me freedom, no pressure, no eyes, just a chance to drive. So I did. And I kept driving, even when the roads were uneven, especially then. You do not need to look like a racer to be one. You just have to listen to the machine, and never listen to people who say you are not part of it." The room went quiet, then stood, not just in applause, but in acknowledgement, because Clara had not simply shown the world how to race, she had reminded it how to see. The week after the ceremony, Clara returned home to find her garage porch filled with notes, cards, even homemade trophies sent by children and amateur drivers from all over. One letter was from a grandfather who had returned to building model cars with his grandson after watching Clara speak. Another was from a mother whose daughter had entered a junior racing league and named her kart after Clara's RX-7. Clara pinned them all to her wall, covering nearly every blank space. She laughed when she realized she needed to install another board just to keep up. That winter, she decided to host an open track weekend at Hollow Ridge, free for first-time drivers, no entry fees, no experience needed, just a helmet, a car that ran, and a willingness to learn. Over 100 people signed up. Some came in hand-me-down sedans, others in tuned-up compacts. All were welcomed. Clara spent both days walking the line, offering quiet advice, encouragement, and the occasional spark plug when someone's engine stuttered. One young man, nervous to take his first lap, admitted he was afraid he would embarrass himself. Clara patted his shoulder and said, "The only thing that embarrasses a driver is not trying." He finished his lap with tears in his eyes. That evening, Clara sat beside her car, sipping tea, as the last few engines cooled in the dusk. The lights above the track flickered on, casting a soft glow over the starting line that now bore her name. She remembered her first day here, the smirks, the dismissals, the disbelief. But that did not matter anymore. Because now, this place, this track, was not just hers. It was everyone's. The asphalt no longer belonged only to those with the loudest engines or shiniest cars. It belonged to those who had something to prove, to those who came despite the doubt, to those who dared. That night, as she locked up the garage, she turned off the light and smiled at the silence. Her racing suit hung on a hook. Her helmet sat neatly beside her seat. Her car, still reliable, still sharp, waited for the next lap. Because for Clara, there would always be a next lap, and not everyone needed to be fast. Some laps were about building, others were about learning, but all of them, every single one, counted. As the final day of the open track weekend wound down, a father approached Clara holding the hand of his young daughter. She looked no older than 8 and wore a cardboard medal around her neck that read, "Fastest Smile." The father explained that his daughter had been terrified to even sit in a car, but after watching Clara patiently guide other beginners, she had agreed to ride along with him, gripping the seat, eyes wide, laughter echoing inside the cabin. "She says she wants to build engines now," he said with quiet gratitude. Clara knelt down and looked the girl in the eye. "That's where the real magic begins," she said. "Driving is just the celebration. Building is the belief." The girl nodded solemnly and reached out to hug her. Later, Clara noticed a boy lingering near her RX-7 long after the crowd had cleared. He did not speak at first, just stared at the car like it was a sacred artifact. Finally, he asked, "Do you think I could ever build something like this?" Clara leaned against the hood and answered, "You already started. You imagined it. Now you just keep going." The boy smiled, took a photo, and ran back to his family. That night, long after the sun had set and every engine had cooled, Clara stayed behind to sweep the paddock herself. Not because she had to, but because she remembered what it felt like to be left behind, and she vowed no one who ever came to her track would feel that again.